A medic kneels over a wounded soldier. Shrapnel embedded in the man's leg. Blood spreading across white gauze. The medic's hands move fast, but his face tells the real story. He's searching for something that isn't there. Morphine. 20 miles behind the front line, in a warehouse that should be overflowing with supplies, the morphine exists. Crates of it. Thousands of vials. Along with canned meat, chocolate bars, medical equipment, everything a soldier could need to survive. But it's not reaching the front line. It's being loaded onto unmarked trucks. Sold. Pocketed. Within hours, General George Patton would learn exactly who was stealing from his men. And what happened next would become one of the most brutal purges of corruption in military history. This is what happened when an army general discovered that American soldiers were being betrayed by the men sworn to protect them. February 1945. A frozen foxhole somewhere in eastern France. The cold here wasn't just temperature, it was a physical thing, a presence that pressed down on everything, that made thinking difficult, that turned survival into arithmetic. Private Danny Russo from Brooklyn sat in that foxhole with his rifle, his uniform, and nothing else. No food. No hope of food arriving anytime soon. For days since he'd eaten anything hot. His last ration had been consumed 2 days ago. Cold beans in a can, tasting like metal and salt. Before that, crackers. Before that, a chocolate bar so frozen it felt like eating wood. Now there was nothing. Just the gnawing in his stomach that had shifted from sharp hunger to a dull, exhausting weakness. He was 23 years old. He'd survived the Normandy landing. He'd made it through 6 months of combat. And now he was slowly starving while sitting 50 yards from an enemy he could see across a snow-covered field. The resupply convoy was supposed to arrive yesterday. It never came. Around him, other soldiers were in the same condition. Sergeant Whitmore sat 2 foxholes over, rationing a single cup of cold coffee that he'd been nursing since dawn. Private Cooper had stopped talking. Russo recognized the signs, not from training, but from watching men break down one piece at a time. Weakness. Confusion. The moment when staying alert became impossible because your body was consuming itself just to stay warm. But here's what made it worse. 20 miles behind the front line, in a place called Supply Depot 7, there were warehouses. Not small ones. Massive structures, the size of small towns, filled floor to ceiling with everything the army had deemed necessary for soldiers to survive. Canned beef, canned pork, fresh bread baked that morning, coffee that was actually hot, chocolate bars by the thousands, cigarettes, matches, medicine, bandages, morphine. All of it existed. All of it was documented in the supply records. And none of it was reaching the men in the foxholes. Russo didn't know the full picture yet. He was just one soldier, and soldiers at the front rarely understood what was happening in the rear. But he knew enough. He'd seen the trucks. Not the official supply trucks with army markings and authorized routes. Different trucks. Unmarked. Moving at night. Moving with purpose. He'd asked a sergeant about it once. Back when he still had hope that someone in authority might actually care. The sergeant had looked at him with an expression that Russo would never forget. Not anger. Not sympathy. Resignation. "Russo," the sergeant had said quietly, "don't ask questions about things the officers want to stay hidden." That's when Russo understood. This wasn't a supply problem. This wasn't incompetence or bad luck or the fog of war. This was deliberate, organized, protected. While he sat in a frozen foxhole, while his stomach cramped and his hands went numb, and he tried to focus on the German positions across the field even though his vision was starting to blur from weakness, someone was eating well. Someone was warm. Someone was getting rich. And the system that was supposed to protect him had already decided he wasn't worth protecting. He didn't know it yet, but his suffering, and the suffering of thousands of men like him, had just triggered something. A report was being filed. An investigation was beginning. And a general was about to smile a very cold smile. But Russo would never see any of it coming. Because while he sat in that foxhole slowly starving, 3 American quartermaster sergeants were loading crates into unmarked trucks 20 miles away. They weren't thinking about him. They weren't thinking about any of the men in the foxholes. They were counting money. What was happening at Supply Depot 7 wasn't an accident. It wasn't a single corrupt officer exploiting a loophole. It wasn't a one-time theft that someone was covering up. It was a system, organized, efficient, running like a well-oiled machine for months without interruption. The network stretched across multiple bases, not just Depot 7. There was Depot 4, 30 miles north, Depot 11, near the Belgian border. Smaller supply points scattered throughout the Third Army's operational area, all of them feeding into the same black market pipeline that had taken on a life of its own. The operation had layers. At the bottom were the enlisted men, truck drivers, warehouse workers, supply clerks, young soldiers who either needed money or had been threatened or coerced into participation. They did the physical work. They loaded the trucks. They kept their mouths shut. Above them were the sergeants and junior officers, the ones who actually managed the theft, who falsified the inventory records, who created the paperwork that made supplies simply vanish from the system without anyone noticing, at least not anyone who mattered. They were the architects of the day-to-day operation. And above them were the colonels and majors, the ones with connections, the ones who had decided that the war would eventually end, and when it did, they wanted to be wealthy. These were the men with bank accounts in Switzerland, the men who had agreements with French black market dealers, the men who knew that if the theft was organized enough, if the protection ran deep enough, they would never be caught. Because that was the real foundation of the network. Protection. Officers at higher levels knew. They had to know. The diversion of supplies at this scale wasn't invisible to anyone with access to the numbers. But those officers had either been paid off, or they had decided that stopping the corruption would create problems for their own careers. So they looked away. Deliberately. There was a young lieutenant named James Harrison who didn't look away. He was newly assigned to Depot 7, fresh out of officer candidate school, still believing that the system was designed to protect soldiers. When he started noticing the discrepancies in the supply records, requisitions showing deliveries that never matched what was actually distributed, he thought it was his duty to report it. He was wrong. When Harrison brought the evidence to his commanding officer, a major named Richard Blackwell, he was met with silence. Then a smile. Then a quiet conversation in a private room where Blackwell explained to him, very carefully, that young officers who asked too many questions about supply matters sometimes found themselves transferred to frontline combat units. Not as company commanders with support, as individual replacement soldiers, where they tended not to survive very long. Harrison got the message. Within 2 weeks, he was transferred, not to a comfortable rear position, to a rifle company in active combat. The message was clear to everyone who witnessed it. Asking about the black market was dangerous, but not everyone received the message in time. There were reports trickling upward through unofficial channels. Enlisted men telling chaplains, soldiers writing letters home about seeing supplies disappear, officers writing memos that ended up in the wrong filing cabinets. The corruption was creating whispers, rumors, the kind of institutional awareness that couldn't be completely suppressed. But it could be ignored. For months, it was ignored. While Rousseau starved in his foxhole, while medics rationed morphine, while wounded soldiers waited for supplies that never arrived, the network continued functioning, growing even, becoming more confident, more reckless, until February 14, 1945. On that day, a medical convoy heading to a field hospital ran out of fuel 20 miles from its destination. 23 wounded American soldiers, some of them critical, sat in freezing ambulances for 6 hours waiting for fuel that should have been readily available. 2 of them didn't make it, and that's when everything changed. Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Boston had survived 3 gunshot wounds in combat. The first one caught him in the shoulder during the push into Belgium. He was patched up, gave blood, spent 3 days in an aid station, and volunteered to return to his unit. The second shot came 6 weeks later, a German sniper's bullet that grazed his ribs. He recovered. He came back. The third bullet hit him in the leg during a night patrol. Bad wound. Bleeding badly. But he survived that too. The medics said he was lucky. The army said he was brave. O'Brien said nothing. He just wanted to go home to his wife in Boston. He almost made it. February 14th, 1945. A medical convoy was moving O'Brien and 22 other wounded soldiers from a forward aid station to a field hospital 50 miles back. Not a dangerous route. Relatively safe. A straightforward movement of casualties who needed more advanced care than field conditions could provide. The convoy ran out of fuel 20 miles from the hospital. Not because there was no fuel. Fuel existed. Fuel had been requisitioned. Fuel should have been loaded into the supply trucks. But it wasn't in those trucks because it had been diverted 3 days earlier to a warehouse near Nancy, France, where it was being processed for sale to French civilians at 5 times the army's cost. The convoy stopped. It sat on the side of a frozen road in February darkness. The ambulances had no heat. The heaters had been running for 3 hours to try to keep the wounded warm. Now the fuel gauge was reading empty. O'Brien was conscious. He was in pain, but he was lucid. He knew what the problem was because he'd been a soldier long enough to recognize when the system had failed him. A medic checked his bandages. The wound was infected. A fever had set in sometime during the transport. He needed antibiotics. He needed the field hospital. He needed to get there soon. But the convoy sat. It sat for 6 hours while the medical officer radioed back to headquarters requesting emergency fuel delivery. It sat while wounded men bled slowly and infection spread and O'Brien's fever climbed and the temperature inside the unheated ambulances dropped to a point where the cold itself became as much a threat as the wounds. 2 soldiers died in that convoy. One was Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Boston. His wife never got to see him again. The other soldier's name was never recorded in the official report. When the fuel finally arrived and the convoy reached the hospital, O'Brien was already gone. The doctor who examined him noted in the medical record that with access to antibiotics and proper care 4 hours earlier, he would have lived. The infection was treatable. The fever was manageable. The fuel shortage was not. The report reached General George S. Patton Jr. on the evening of February 14, 1945. His aide brought it to him during a staff meeting. 1 page. A summary. A minor logistics incident with a tragic outcome. Patton read it once. Then he read it again. His staff watched. They knew Patton well enough to recognize the signs. The way his jaw tightened. The way his eyes moved across the page slowly, carefully, reading between the lines. The attached investigation, the one that had been quietly buried by Logistics Command, that detailed months of supply diversion, black market activity, and a network of theft that reached across multiple bases. Patton set the papers down on his desk. And then he smiled. Not a happy smile. Not an angry smile. The smile of a predator who had just caught a scent. The smile of a man who had identified a target and was already calculating how to destroy it completely. "Get me the Inspector General," he said quietly. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "Get me the Provost Marshal. Get me the JAG office. And get me the commander of every supply depot in the Third Army." He paused. "Let the silence settle. I want them all in this room. 2 hours." They arrived within 2 hours. Colonels, lieutenant colonels, majors, well-connected officers who had spent months accumulating wealth while soldiers froze and starved. They arrived expecting a routine briefing, maybe a supply situation update, something administrative. What they found was different. The conference room had been transformed. Military police stood along the back wall. Criminal Investigation Division agents occupied the corners. JAG officers sat at a secondary table with files and notebooks. The room itself had become something else, no longer a place for discussion, but a venue for judgment. The senior officers felt it immediately. The change in energy was physical. The colonels exchanged glances. Some straightened in their chairs. Others seemed to shrink slightly, some instinct telling them that the comfortable assumptions they'd made about their protection and their connections were about to be tested. Patton didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Gentlemen," he began, standing at the head of the conference table. His voice was level, not loud, not angry, just present and heavy with authority. I'm going to ask you a very simple question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. He paused. Are any of you aware of supply theft? Black market sales? The diversion of materials meant for combat troops? The room was silent. Several officers exchanged glances. One colonel, the one everyone knew had the congressional connections, started to speak. Sir, there may be some minor irregularities in accounting. In an operation this size, minor irregularities. Patton repeated the phrase. His voice dropped, not to a whisper, but to something quieter, more dangerous than anything he'd said before. Let me tell you about a minor irregularity. He picked up a single sheet of paper from his desk. 2nd Armored Division, Brooklyn, Boston, survived 3 gunshot wounds in combat. 3 times the Germans tried to kill him, and 3 times he came back to his unit because he wanted to go home to his wife. Patton looked directly at the assembled officers. He died in an ambulance that ran out of fuel. The fuel that should have been in that ambulance was sold on the black market instead of distributed to medical units. His death is a minor irregularity. He set the paper down carefully. Private Danny Russo is currently in a foxhole on the front line. He hasn't eaten in 4 days because his rations were sold to French civilians instead of delivered to his unit. His hunger is a minor irregularity. The room was absolutely silent now. Patton walked around the table, not threatening, just moving, letting them feel the weight of his presence. I have evidence here of systematic theft from army supplies. I have documented cases of food, medicine, fuel, ammunition, and equipment being diverted and sold. I have testimony from enlisted men who tried to report this and were silenced. And I have reason to believe that some of you in this room are either directly involved or have knowingly turned a blind eye to protect your subordinates or your careers. The color drained from several faces. So here's what's going to happen, Patton continued. The MPs standing behind you are going to escort each of you to separate rooms. You're going to be interviewed under oath by JAG officers. You're going to provide complete accounting of every supply shipment under your command for the last 6 months. Your financial records, personal and official, are being subpoenaed as we speak. He paused. And if we find one shred of evidence that you participated in, profited from, or knowingly ignored supply theft, I will personally ensure that you spend the rest of your life in a military prison. Then it happened. A colonel named Peterson stood up abruptly. His face was flushed. His voice carried the confidence of a man who believed his connections mattered more than facts. General Patton, I don't have to sit here and be accused. Sit down, Colonel. The 2 words cut through the room like a gunshot. Or be sat down by the MPs. Your choice. Peterson remained standing. I have friends in Washington. I have congressional connections. You can't just call them. Patton moved around the table. Not fast, deliberate. He got directly in Peterson's face. Call every friend you have in Washington, and when you get them on the phone, explain to them why Sergeant Michael O'Brien is dead 0300 hours. 3 in the morning, the time when most men are sleeping deeply, when the body is most vulnerable, when shock and disorientation are at their peak. Patton didn't choose this time by accident. Military police descended on supply depots like an invading force. Not a gentle knock, not a request. MPs with arrest authority, CID agents with seizure warrants, legal officers with subpoenas, all of them moving with coordinated precision across a dozen locations simultaneously. Shocked quartermaster personnel found themselves roused from their bunks in darkness. Weapons drawn, orders barked, hands searched, quarters torn apart. The officers in charge weren't treated gently. Colonel Peterson was found in his quarters at Depot 7. When the MPs burst through his door, he was in bed. They gave him 30 seconds to dress before escorting him to an interrogation room. His personal safe was opened by force. Inside, documents and cash. Lots of cash. $180,000 in American currency. Swiss banking documents showing deposits totaling another $200,000. A ledger with his own handwriting documenting transactions going back 18 months. Peterson's face went white. At Depot 4, investigators discovered Major Richard Blackwell had built something far more sophisticated than simple theft. He wasn't just selling supplies. He was running an organized crime operation that spanned 3 countries. Warehouses in occupied France. Contacts with black market dealers in Belgium. Agreements with corrupt local officials. Distribution networks that moved stolen goods through civilian channels with the precision of a legitimate business. Blackwell had trucks. He had cash flow. He had a crew of enlisted men who did the physical work while he managed the operation from an office. When investigators raided his personal quarters, they found $30,000 in cash, jewelry, expensive watches, ledgers dating back 18 months documenting every transaction, names, dates, quantities, destinations, a comprehensive record of betrayal written in Blackwell's own hand. But the most damaging discovery came from a different source entirely. Corporal Thomas Martinez was a supply clerk at Depot 7. 8 months earlier, he'd noticed the discrepancies. Supplies going in, fewer supplies coming out. The math wasn't working, so he'd done what he was supposed to do. He'd reported it to his superiors. His commanding officer listened, then told him very clearly that making false accusations could result in a court-martial. That young enlisted men who questioned supply procedures sometimes found themselves reassigned to rifle companies. That he should keep his mouth shut and forget what he'd seen. Martinez got the message, but he didn't forget. Instead, he'd quietly documented everything. Dates, quantities, names, transactions, all of it written in a small notebook that he carried in his pocket. For 8 months, he'd been a witness to the theft and powerless to stop it. So he did the only thing he could: he preserved evidence. When CID agents interviewed him during the raids, Martinez handed over his notebook with shaking hands. "I watched them sell food while guys on the front line were starving," he said, his voice barely controlled. "I watched them laugh about it, joke about how stupid the combat troops were, how they were the real smart ones making money while idiots got shot at." He paused. "And when I tried to stop it, they threatened to ruin my life. So I wrote it all down, every single thing, because I knew eventually someone would care enough to actually do something about it." Patton personally read Martinez's testimony. He immediately ordered the young corporal brought to headquarters. When Martinez stood in front of the general, nervous and uncertain, Patton did something the corporal wasn't expecting. He shook his hand. "Corporal," Patton said quietly, "you did what every soldier should do when they see wrong being done. You documented it. You preserved evidence. And you waited for the right moment to act. That takes courage, especially when the people doing wrong have power over you." He paused. "I'm promoting you to sergeant, effective immediately. You're going to work directly with the Inspector General's office for the duration of this investigation. Your knowledge is going to help us burn this corruption down to the ground." Martinez stammered his thanks. "Don't thank me, Sergeant. Thank yourself for having the integrity to do the right thing when it was dangerous and unrewarding." Patton's order was unprecedented. The accused officers would spend 1 week attached to frontline combat units. Not behind the lines. Not in safe positions. Actual frontline duty in foxholes, eating the same rations as combat troops, sleeping in the same conditions, facing the same dangers. "I want these men to understand exactly what they were stealing from," Patton explained to his staff. "I want them to sit in a frozen foxhole and feel what it's like to be hungry because supplies didn't arrive. I want them to watch combat soldiers ration their food and wonder where their next meal is coming from. I want them to experience firsthand, personally, the consequences of their theft." The legal officers objected. "Sir, putting accused personnel in combat situations before their trials could be seen as prejudicial. As pre-trial punishment." "It's not punishment," Patton shot back. "It's evidence gathering. They're going to testify about supply conditions at the front. How can they testify accurately if they've never experienced those conditions? 1 week. Then we try them. Then we punish them. Colonel Peterson lasted 3 days before he broke completely. On the first day, he was issued the same rations that frontline troops received. Meager portions. Cold beans from a tin. A single chocolate bar meant to sustain a soldier through brutal conditions. Peterson, who had been eating well from stolen supplies for months. Prime cuts of beef, canned delicacies, fresh bread. Found himself rationing a chocolate bar like it was made of gold. He barely ate anything. On the second day, a resupply convoy that was supposed to bring hot food and fresh rations never arrived. Peterson, sitting in a frozen foxhole with 3 combat infantrymen who had been living this way for months, asked the sergeant when they'd eat next. The sergeant looked at him with barely concealed contempt. "When it gets here, sir. Sometimes that's tomorrow. Sometimes that's 3 days from now. Sometimes the supplies get lost somewhere between the depot and the front line." The sarcasm was thick enough to cut with a knife. Peterson said nothing, but that night, shivering in the foxhole as artillery fire rumbled in the distance, he began to understand in a way that no amount of testimony or evidence could have taught him. He understood what his theft had actually meant. On the third day, a soldier in the next foxhole over, a young private from Tennessee named Billy Cooper, took a bullet through the shoulder during a German probe. The medics came quickly, but they were low on morphine, low on bandages, low on the supplies that should have been abundant, but had been systematically stolen and sold. Cooper screamed in agony as a medic worked on him with inadequate supplies, apologizing repeatedly. "I'm sorry, son. I know it hurts. We're almost out of pain medication. Just hold on." Peterson watched this scene from 15 feet away, and something inside him shattered. When the medics finally stabilized Cooper and evacuated him to an aid station, Peterson turned to the combat sergeant sharing his foxhole and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I did this. The missing supplies. Some of that was me." The sergeant looked at him for a long moment. The expression on his face was neither surprise nor anger. It was the cold, flat look of a man whose worst assumptions about humanity had just been confirmed. "I know who you are, Colonel. We all know. General Patton made sure we knew before he sent you out here. Said you needed to see what you'd been stealing from." Peterson's voice cracked. "I didn't think. I never saw. It was just numbers on paper. Just inventory to me. I didn't think about actual soldiers. Actual wounded men. Actual—" "Save it for your trial," the sergeant interrupted. "You got 2 more days out here before they take you back for court-martial. Try not to get any of my men killed while you're learning your lesson." The week devastated most of the accused officers psychologically in ways interrogation could never achieve. Major Blackwell spent his week attached to a tank unit. On the 5th day, his tank platoon ran low on fuel during a tactical withdrawal and had to abandon 1 tank that couldn't be moved without fuel. The crew barely escaped before German anti-tank fire destroyed their vehicle. Blackwell heard the tank commander, a hard-bitten lieutenant who'd been fighting since Normandy, radio back to headquarters. "Lost tank number 37. No fuel for extraction. Another supply shortage. But I'm sure the fuel went somewhere important. I'm sure somebody thought it was more valuable to be sold to French civilians than used to save American armor." Where Peterson felt guilt and shame, Blackwell felt rage, at himself, at the system, at the soldiers who now looked at him with undisguised contempt, at Patton for forcing him to experience the consequences of his actions. But beneath the rage was something else. The inescapable understanding that he had betrayed men who depended on him, that his pursuit of money had directly contributed to American deaths and suffering. But 3 officers came back different. 3 came back unbroken. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb and 2 others returned from their frontline week even more defiant, more convinced that they had done nothing truly wrong, that soldiers had always scrounged and civilians had always operated black markets, that what they'd done was no different than what countless others had done in every war throughout history. These 3 would provide Patton with the perfect opportunity. The court-martials began in early March 1945. Patton ordered that representatives from every combat unit in 3rd Army be present to observe. He wanted frontline soldiers to see that justice was being done, that the men who had stolen from them were being held accountable. The trials were swift and devastating. Colonel Peterson's trial lasted 2 days. He pleaded guilty to all charges. No lawyers, no elaborate defense. Just Peterson standing before the court, describing how the network operated, who was involved, how they covered their tracks. His testimony implicated a dozen other officers. In his final statement before sentencing, Peterson stood. His voice shook. "I have no excuse for what I did. I saw an opportunity to make money and I took it. And I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just the army, just supplies, just numbers." He paused. "But I spent a week in a foxhole with soldiers who were hungry because of what I stole. I watched a wounded man suffer because medical supplies I sold were missing when he needed them. And I understand now that what I did wasn't just theft. It was betrayal." He looked directly at the assembled soldiers. "I betrayed every soldier who trusted that the army would take care of them. I deserve whatever punishment this court gives me, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what I've done." The court sentenced Peterson to 15 years hard labor, dishonorable discharge, stripped of rank, pension, and military honors. The man who had been a colonel, who had commanded hundreds of men and controlled millions of dollars in supplies, was reduced to prisoner number 4457 in a military labor camp. Major Blackwell's trial was different. Unlike Peterson, Blackwell maintained that he had done nothing different from what countless supply officers had done throughout history, that the black market was a natural consequence of war, that prosecuting him was selective enforcement designed to make an example rather than achieve justice. His defense attorney argued that Blackwell was a scapegoat, that the real problem was systemic, that individual officers shouldn't be held responsible for institutional failures. The prosecution's response was delivered by Major Sarah Cohen, a JAG officer with a reputation for meticulous preparation. She stood before the court and methodically destroyed Blackwell's defense. "The defense would have you believe that Major Blackwell is a victim of circumstance," she began, "that he simply participated in a system that encouraged corruption." She presented evidence. Blackwell had deliberately falsified reports of German attacks on supply convoys to explain missing supplies. He had created fake distribution records showing deliveries that never happened. He had bribed junior officers and threatened enlisted men who questioned his activities. Then she held up the ledger. "This man didn't just steal food and cigarettes," Cohen stated, her voice steady and precise. "He sold medicine. He sold medical supplies that wounded soldiers needed to survive." She opened the ledger to a page marked with Blackwell's own handwriting. Morphine, sulfa drugs, blood plasma, medical supplies that could mean the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers. And he did it knowingly, deliberately, for profit. She turned to face Blackwell directly. "How many American soldiers died because morphine that should have eased their pain was sold to French civilians? How many died from infections that could have been prevented with sulfa drugs that Major Blackwell sold instead of distributed? We'll never know the exact number, but we know it's more than zero. And every single one of those deaths is in his hands." Silence in the courtroom. "You're not a scapegoat, Major. You're a criminal who got caught. The only question is whether this court has the courage to hold you accountable." The court convicted Blackwell on all charges and sentenced him to 25 years hard labor. But Patton wasn't finished. After the sentence was read, Patton invoked a rarely used provision of military law allowing additional administrative punishment beyond the court-martial sentence. He ordered that Blackwell, before being transferred to military prison, would spend 6 months assigned to graves registration duty, recovering and burying American dead from recent battlefields. The same duty that had broken other officers. "You sold medical supplies that could have saved soldiers' lives," Patton stated in his written order. "You will spend 6 months honoring the dead who might have lived if you'd done your job. You will handle their bodies with respect. You will ensure they are properly identified and buried. And you will think about what your greed cost them and their families. Only then will you go to prison." Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb was the last of the major cases. He was convicted not just of theft and corruption, but of obstruction of justice for threatening witnesses and destroying evidence. 30 years hard labor, dishonorable discharge. His photograph was published in Stars and Stripes. A once proud officer, now a convicted criminal. A cautionary tale about what happened when greed infected the military supply system. By the end of March 1945, the numbers were staggering. 43 convictions. Officers and enlisted personnel sentenced to a combined total of over 200 years of hard labor. Dishonorable discharges flowing like a purge. Money recovered from Swiss accounts, seized in raids, liquidated from recovered goods. Approximately $1.20 to $2 million returned to the system. But the real measure wasn't in numbers. Black market activity in Third Army's operational area dropped by over 90%. Supply shortages on the front lines virtually disappeared. The warehouses that had been systematically looted were now delivering supplies on schedule. Every quartermaster, every supply sergeant, every enlisted man working in logistics understood with absolute clarity what happened to those who stole from soldiers. The system changed. Patton didn't just prosecute the criminals. He reorganized the entire supply infrastructure. New oversight procedures were implemented. Mandatory audits.
Surprise inspection.
Financial accountability at every level. Severe penalties weren't just theoretical anymore. They were demonstrated. They were real. And every soldier in Third Army knew it. The story spread through the ranks like electricity. Officers who had thought themselves untouchable were now in military prisons. Colonels who had congressional connections were stripped of rank and honor. The system itself had proven that it could be held accountable. That betrayal had consequences. That integrity, when enforced, mattered more than rank or connections or wealth. Private Danny Russo was eating hot meals now. Not because the war had ended, not because he'd rotated home, but because the supplies that were supposed to reach him were actually reaching him. The rations were still cold sometimes. The coffee still tasted like it came from tin. But there was food, regular food, enough food. He was no longer starving in a foxhole. Around him, other soldiers noticed the difference. Wounded men were getting morphine when they needed it. Medical supplies weren't mysteriously disappearing. Ambulances had fuel. The basic infrastructure that was supposed to keep soldiers alive was actually doing its job. Because the men stealing from that infrastructure were in prison. Patton never mentioned the anti-corruption campaign in his official history. It wasn't a battlefield victory. It didn't gain territory or defeat German divisions. But it did something that many considered more important. It proved that the American military system could police itself. That it could hold its own people accountable, even when those people had power and connections. That institutional integrity was possible, not theoretical. This isn't a story about battlefield victories. This is a story about the constant struggle to maintain integrity when corruption is easy and integrity is hard. When you can make a fortune selling supplies meant for starving soldiers, and when the system that's supposed to stop you is weak and compromised, doing the right thing isn't a matter of courage. It's a matter of character. But when one man, Patton, decided that he would not tolerate the betrayal of soldiers under his command, when he used every tool available to him to find the corruption, prosecute it, and publicly destroy it, he sent a message that echoed through the entire army. Soldiers matter more than careers. Integrity matters more than connections. And if you betray the men you're supposed to protect, there will be consequences. 42 years later, Corporal Thomas Martinez, the young supply clerk who had documented the theft while everyone else looked away, would carry Sergeant Michael O'Brien's name in his wallet. O'Brien, who had survived 3 gunshot wounds in combat and died in a frozen ambulance because fuel had been sold on the black market. Martinez carried that name as a reminder that integrity under pressure isn't rewarded in the moment. Sometimes it costs you. Sometimes it makes you unpopular. Sometimes you're threatened for doing it. But eventually, justice finds its way. So here's the question we want you to think about. Did Patton go too far? Or not far enough? Were the sentences harsh enough for men who sold medicine that soldiers needed to survive? Or was the real genius in making the corruption public? In forcing soldiers to witness that their own institution had turned on the people who were stealing from them? That's what we want to know. Drop a comment below. Tell us your perspective. And if this story changed how you understand military leadership, if it showed you a side of Patton that goes beyond the battlefield, then hit that subscribe button. Because these are the stories they don't tell you about. The internal battles. The battles against corruption. The battles to maintain integrity when nobody's watching and when everyone has good reasons to look away. Those are the battles that define institutions.